Okay, third graders, so now I'm going to read chapters 4 and 5 together without stopping. Chapter 4. It was just before midnight. The partygoers headed up through the halls towards the main deck, and Grace followed them. A lot of the other people from the first and second class decks were doing the same. On the main deck, a large crowd was quickly gathering by the rail. The night air was freezing, and the stars glittered in the dark sky above them. The sea was strangely calm, and everybody was looking up at something white and glittering and enormous drifting past the stationary ship. Grace had never seen anything like it. "It's an iceberg," one man yelled. "We've hit an iceberg and we're going to sink." People in the crowd looked around worried and started to mutter to each other. Surely this man was talking nonsense. Suddenly, the bow of the ship lurched downward with a terrible grinding noise. Moments later, one of the crew cried out that the captain had given orders to lower the lifeboats. They were going to abandon ship. Grace felt very scared and alone. She thought of Auntie Nora, and tears filled her eyes. She couldn't believe the Titanic was sinking. The newspapers had said that the ship was unsinkable. But now lifeboats were splashing down into the sea as Grace stood motionless in the chaos around her. Word spread that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and people started to panic. Soon there was a lot of yelling and screaming and pushing and shoving, but Grace couldn't leave the ship without Uncle Patrick's address or Auntie Nora's photograph. She had to go back to the cabin for her suitcase before trying to find a place on the lifeboat. When Grace reached the staircases leading down to the third-class decks, she found they had been closed off. She had to go a different way, but soon she was lost inside the ship's maze and hallways. "Come on, think," she whispered to herself. "Now where do I go?" Just then the floor shook beneath Grace's feet, and the ship groaned and creaked around her. The lights flickered above her. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks as she realized she would have to leave her belongings behind and return to the main deck. She was running out of time, and she had never felt so alone. But she pulled herself together, wiped her eyes on her sleeves, and strode quickly towards the stairs. Getting back to the main deck wasn't easy, though. All the hallways were at steep angles now, and in some places Grace had to pull herself along the wall, as if she were climbing a mountain. The lights were flickering even more, and everywhere seemed eerily empty. At last she spotted someone ahead of her, a girl. As Grace got closer to her, she realized it was Catherine, the girl who had gotten her in trouble. Their eyes met, and Grace knew Catherine recognized her too. Catherine ran up to Grace and grabbed her arm, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, you have to help me," said Catherine, her voice cracking. "I got separated from my parents and I'm lost and I don't know what to do." "Let go of me," Grace snapped. She pulled her arm free. "Why should I help you after what you did? You must be joking." Grace turned away from her. "I'm sorry," Catherine was screaming. "Don't leave me." Grace stopped with her back to Catherine and closed her eyes. She remembered what Auntie Nora had said. "You're too nice for your own good sometimes." It was true, but Grace also knew it would be wrong to leave Catherine here alone. She sighed and turned back. All of a sudden, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 5. Catherine screamed. Grace knew she would have to take charge, even though she felt terrified herself. The two girls stumbled in the dark as she dragged Catherine along the hallway. After a while, they came to an area where the lights were flickering, but now the floor started to shake, and the hallway seemed to tip even more sharply. Grace felt like she was in a nightmare as they turned down hallway after hallway, but at last they came to a staircase that Grace recognized. It would take them to the main deck. They'd climb upward only to discover that things had gotten much worse. The Titanic was creaking and groaning like a giant beast in agony, and its front part was now completely underwater. Most of the lifeboats had been launched, but there still seemed to be as many passengers on board the Titanic as ever. Grace saw quite a few people struggling into life preserves and jumping into the icy sea far below. "Come on this way," Grace said, and she pulled Catherine towards a lifeboat that hadn't been launched yet. Suddenly a voice called out, "Catherine! Oh, thank goodness we found you." It was Catherine's mother pushing through the crowd. She grabbed her daughter and held her tight. Catherine's father appeared from the crowd. "We must hurry," he said. "They won't be able to launch the lifeboat if they have to wait any longer." The three of them started moving towards the ship's rail, Catherine's father roughly pushing people out of their way. Grace followed and found herself at last looking down into a lifeboat. It was almost full, but there were still a few free places. A couple of the crew helped Catherine and her parents into the boat through a gate in the rail. Just as Catherine was about to climb down into the boat herself, one of the crewmen put his arm out to stop her. "Hold it," he said, looking Grace up and down. "Only first-class passengers are allowed in this lifeboat." "Shame on you," a man yelled behind Grace. Others angrily called out too. Grace stood shivering in the cold night air, jostled by the crowd, her eyes filling with tears once more. "But she saved me," Catherine said quietly to her father. Catherine's father stood up. "Let her on," he said to the crewman. "She's with us." The man nodded and helped Grace down into the lifeboat. She sat on the bench next to Catherine, who squeezed her hand. "I couldn't let them leave you behind," said Catherine. "I'd still be lost if it hadn't been for you." Grace looked up at Catherine's parents, who were watching them. "Thank you," Catherine's mother whispered to her through an exhausted smile. Just then, the lifeboat was lowered and they splashed down into the sea. The crewmen at the oars rowed them away from the sinking ship. Grace turned around and saw that the Titanic was sliding beneath the water in a huge cloud of steam. Catherine's father leaned over. "Don't worry, Grace," he said, with a kind expression on his face. "We'll take care of you." As the lifeboat bobbed gently on the waves, Grace wondered what would happen next time. She was only halfway to America, but at least she felt safe for now, sitting between Catherine and her parents. The end. That was the end of chapter 4 and 5. So on the next few slides, you are going to do the central message of this story. Along on this slide is chapters 1 through 3, if you need to go back and refresh your mind over those readings.